Hello, and welcome back to Colonel O'Truth's Miniature Issues and the continuing build of Undercrag City. This is the fifth video concerning the caves beneath Undercrag City. In this one, I'm going to detail and paint the first buildings. I've covered some of these techniques before, but they bear repeating. Here I'm cutting 2mm wide balsa wood strips, which will be used to create the timber detailing of a Tudor style building. I start by adding my horizontals. And then I'll add verticals and smaller details. You can see this little block of buildings is an odd shape. I've glued these two pieces together to make life easier for installation. The smaller building will actually be more of a cave. You can see I've also got some steps leading up to the door from where this building will meet with the street. An even finer piece of balsa wood sits here to continue the look of the timbering behind the stairs. It's all quite fiddly stuff. The odd curve cut into the divider gives me a rough outline of where I want my stone to be when I craft the cave walls. But for now, I'm just cutting small pieces of balsa and gradually creating the look of the main building. With the main horizontals in place, the main verticals go in. It's been mentioned previously in the comments that timber buildings in a cave structure wouldn't last very long due to damp and so on. This is probably absolutely true, but a little bit of magic goes a long way. Anyway, I want the square design and the colour of the buildings to contrast strongly with the cave walls themselves. Regardless, I suspect living down here might not be as pleasant as outside. Keeping things nice and regular and square. What would I do without my faithful pointy stick? The glue might look quite messy, but I'm not too worried at the moment. I'll clean off the worst of the blobs, and the rest will shrink as it dries. Now to put some details in. By measuring corner to corner across this panel, I get the length of the piece it needs to sit in. I cut the ends to a point, and hey presto, quite a neat little fit. A small piece of balsa wood with planks sketched in with a pencil creates the door quite easily. Working it into place and leaving a gap at the bottom. Whoops. I only want a small gap, but it'll allow light to come through when my LEDs are inside. You can also see there are a couple of windows on the side of the building I haven't finished. I've decided I'm going to cover those with stone. And here we go. I'm coating the areas that will be stone with neat PVA, and then I'll start adding air drying clay. I'm doing a lot of work on the cave wall here as a set piece that will be put into the main model, rather than adding the buildings in and sculpting the walls afterwards. Not being very tidy about this, I'm just blobbing the clay on. More PVA over the clay. This keeps it malleable and prevents it from cracking. I don't think that paintbrush is going to forgive me. Now a door for the cave section. The best way of doing this was to sculpt the clay onto the front and clean off any excess that got through the doorway before adding the balsa door in. It keeps everything neat and flat. Now I'm thinking about the roof of the caves. The section of foam I'm working into this comes to a pointed edge at the top. That's important. It's part of my method for lining up one piece to the next. A lot more clay. You can see I'm working very quickly. I haven't allowed everything to dry yet. I'll just keep going. More glue. I'm smoothing out the rocks and also working them into rock shapes rather than clay blobs. It all needs to look organic. And then I realise I forgot to add timbers underneath the building's overhang. Ideally, I should have added those earlier. These are pieces of matchstick to give a bit more bulk. And how about a post? Make sure that's fairly straight. Now for some paint. Starting with a light grey undercoat, just on the building parts. Doesn't have to be perfect. Doesn't matter if there's a bit of overlap. I'm just working quickly now. Once the grey is dry, I'm covering all of those parts with brown ink. It looks like a lot of ink, but it's really only 3 or 4 drops. Now that that's dry, I've blocked in all of the stone in a dark grey. I'm going to dry brush on all of the brown parts with a pale yellow and then a white. Again, I'm not worried if there's a little bit of overlap. I can tidy things up later. I'm catching the highlights on the timbers and making sure I work enough of the yellow into the panels in between. But I'm not blocking it out perfectly. I want different tones of brown and yellow to come through. It's quite messy, it's not precise. Brightening up a few of the panels. And now white over the same areas. Again, I don't want uniformity. When all of that's dry, it's back to the brown ink. Being a bit more careful now, and picking out all of the timbers. I'm starting with the flat faces of the timbers, but I mustn't forget to get down the edges as well. They're 3-dimensional. The brown ink combines with the slapdash approach of the undercoat and dry brushing to give lots of interesting tones to the wood. Prevents it from looking too flat and boring. Not forgetting the doors. And now it's onto the stonework. You can see I've added some acetate behind the windows as glass. I've talked about this before in other videos. The dark grey stone gets a highlight of light grey, which will be followed by white. There's some glue on the acetate windows there, that's deliberate. It'll dry clear and help to obscure what's inside, namely the LEDs I'm going to build in. Now some very small pieces of thin black card will create the door hardware. I'm not getting over detailed on this, just some simple shapes. Looking good. Now a thin black wash over all of the stone. This goes on looking very dark, but it fades as it dries. And I need to be careful not to let it run all over my nicely finished building. Now while the black is wet, I'm adding touches of green and then yellow around any areas where light might escape from the buildings. I mentioned in my last video, the idea is that the light encourages things to grow where normally they wouldn't because of the complete darkness of the caves. The yellow combines with the green and the wet black ink to create lots of different tones, extra texture for the buildings. I want this part to be messy. Now to pick out the door hardware with a little bit of silver, followed by a touch of rust ink. Just as I've done on all of the other buildings of Undercrag. I think that looks quite nice and bright. In the next video, I'll show you how I sculpted this into the main cave system, and I'll finish it off and move on to the next part. In the meantime, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope to see you next time. Bye for now.